Welcome to another video about literary analysis essay writing. Today's lesson is on summary, paraphrasing, and quoting of evidence for your essays. One issue I see with evidence is when students are trying to incorporate examples into their writing. Remember that examples should really include the most important details which support your points you are making about your interpretation of the text. First, you need to pinpoint examples on the page. If you can't point to a page of the example you want to use, then you may be too broad with your ideas. For example, if I say that my first example of animal symbolism is when Lenny is compared to one, that's far too general and is not really proven by what is said. Where does the author do this? Why not use their exact words so it is indisputable? The key here is to dig back through your notes and the text to find the most specific evidence you can find. That way, someone can't just say that they don't agree with you. You can point to the text itself and prove it. They also have a harder time accusing you of misinterpretation. For this phase, we will assume you've found some quality scenes, moments, sentences, and words from the text that prove your point. In this tutorial, I'm using examples from John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, focusing mostly on animal symbolism, comparisons to animals, and animalistic behavior from the characters. First of all, what is the difference between paraphrasing and summarizing? There is a line between the two of them. Summarizing is when you take a large chunk of text and capture the main idea or gist of the section. For example, if I said that when Curly starts punching Lenny and George tells Lenny to fight back, Lenny uses his animalistic strength, which results in him crushing Curly's hand. This scene I just summarized takes almost 2 full pages in the book. So what I've just done in one sentence is really a summary. I really condensed it down, left out lots of details and interactions and dialogue. I captured the main point, but I did not just take something and put it in my own words. If I did that, I would have paraphrased. So we would use paraphrasing of evidence when the way the author wrote the details is either not easily quotable or they said it better. So remember, if you can't say it better than the author yourself, why not just quote their actual words that they used? Let's look at this example for paraphrasing. Now, for this example, I could definitely do a method that I do later in this video, which is selective quoting with paraphrasing, but for the sake of this instruction, we're just going to work on paraphrasing it. These happen to be the opening lines to the book that my students are reading, and it describes the setting of chapter 1, which is the same location as chapter 6. It's a pivotal location in the book, so maybe I want to use this to highlight how this idea of animals, survival, and nature are woven into the book from the get-go. It's also the place where one of the main characters has to kill the other main character at the end of the book. Spoiler alert. So this is definitely, you can look at this text and see it's way too long for an essay. It's 2 paragraphs long. It's just too much. So I have to ask myself, what is the most important part? And when I paraphrase, what parts should I paraphrase? And then later on, if I want to do selective quoting, I could maybe build in some quotes. But for now, we're just going to focus on paraphrasing and say, I just want to put it in my own words and cite it. Now remember, even when I'm paraphrasing or summarizing, I need to cite the page numbers. So my kids are using a PDF, so you're going to see in this video that I always put the author's last name, PDF, and then the number. And that's to differentiate between the PDF version of page numbers and the physical book, because my students are using both. So that's the reason why you're going to see PDF in parentheses. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in here and look at it. So I know this section is this beautiful description of the Salinas River. I know there's all these trees around it that talks about the sycamore trees with all their leaves. It has this worn branch that all these guys have come to sit on that come down from the road. There's rabbits here, raccoons come here at night. There's dogs that come down from the ranches. It's just a place that, kind of an area where everybody comes together. There's a path, again, where the guys come down from the ranches to swim here. There are tramps that come down from the highway to be near the water. So it is a place where it provides that water that is necessary for survival, but it also brings in animals and human beings. And the title of our book is Of Mice and Men, Humans and Animals. And there is this connection in the book thematically between the two. So that's why I think this is so important to point out that from the get-go, we have a place where men and animals and this idea of that are together. So how am I going to paraphrase? I need to put in my own words and keep it true to it. I don't just want to say that the opening scene of the book is just this river place. I want to be more specific and just put these descriptions in my own words. So I might say something like, the novel opens up, because I'm giving some context of where it comes from, with a detailed description of the Salinas River, which is near a ranch where the main characters work. Now this is a little bit of summary, and I'm referencing things later, but I'm kind of setting up why I'm describing it. This is a location. Now in my own words, how would I describe it? That is, I'm going to say that provides water, rest, and relaxation to both animals and humans. Probably period there. And now I might continue my paraphrasing. Besides the water, and here I could have started quoting what the water's described at, but again, I'm focusing on showing you guys how to paraphrase. Besides water being available, there are the comforts, the sandy shore, a place to make fires, and a branch which has been worn into a seat. I didn't come too close to quoting it there, that's what I got to make sure of, otherwise I should quote it. That's one thing that's tricky with paraphrase. It's easy to accidentally start quoting because you're not really differentiating that much from it. And then I'm just going to end with where I got it from, Steinbeck, PDF 1, and a period outside of that. So notice nothing's in quotation marks because it's all in my own words, and I put it at the end of all of this paraphrasing. All right? So that right there, that is how I paraphrase. So another way I can use paraphrase is in conjunction with selective quoting. I mentioned that earlier. This is probably the best way to use paraphrasing in my opinion, because you're able to get in the specifics of the author's writing while not taking too long to do that. It also makes it sound more natural with your writing because you're just using selective words, phrases to put into it. So in this case, we're not going to really use whole sentences. We're just going to use key details. And I just think this makes your writing flow really well if you use this as one technique. Now, in this, all the techniques in this video, you can kind of mix and match and use them throughout your paper, and it will really give you some variety of how you're incorporating your evidence. So we're going to work on first looking at this section that I have on your screen. This comes from the end of the book of Mice and Men. Yes, there are spoilers. If you don't want that, I guess stop watching this video. This is the beginning of chapter 6 when Steinbeck is describing the Salinas River again, which is where we were in the last example, but it was at the beginning of the book, and now we're at the end of the book coming full circle. So just to give you the gist of this, it is two snakes that are in this scene. The first one comes on scene and gets eaten by a heron, and then Lenny comes into the scene, our main character, disrupts the bird, so the bird takes off and flies away, so a snake that it was waiting for ends up being able to survive and move on. So those are my most important quotations that I'm going to highlight. So that's one thing, is when you're wanting to do selective quoting, you got to think of like, what's the most important thing? So I'm going to first narrow down by, of course, it's the water snake that gets eaten, which is that paragraph. And then if you keep reading, it goes down here to the heron waiting, and it says another water snake does this, and then later the little snake slid in among the reeds at the poolside. So that's how it's able to get away. Okay. Now I'm still not going to quote these whole sentences, but I've narrowed my focus a little bit for you guys. So now I'm going to, in another color, I'm going to decide what to keep. What are the most pivotal details and quotations? We're definitely going to mention the water snake glided smoothly at the pool. The periscope head is kind of cool, but I don't know that it is that important for what I'm doing, because the reason I'm using this example is I feel like this scene foreshadows the death of our main character, because there are two snakes here. And throughout this book, animals have been used to represent people or be connected to people in some way. And so here we have two main characters in this book that are close friends this whole time and take care of each other and are companions. And in this scene, we have two water snakes. One of them ends up getting eaten by the heron, and the other one is able to get away. And that's exactly what happens in this chapter. Lenny is killed by George, so in a way, eaten by the heron. And then George is able to escape the situation. Now we know it's tragic and everything, but that's how it connects. So there's really this foreshadowing going on. The number 2 is here. It matches up. What happens to each of the snakes, their destinies align with these characters and what ends up happening to them in the chapter. So that's why. So I'm thinking that. And then I could say, swallowed the little snake is maybe an important detail because that's what happens to it. I could use the motionless heron. Okay, so the snake's unaware, just like Lenny's unaware. And then I could have another little water snake. And then maybe slid it among the reeds. Okay, so I started to kind of narrow down. Normally I would do this all in my brain. Okay, but I'm just showing you guys my thought process. All right, so now I'm just gonna write. Okay. So I'm going to do a mixture of paraphrasing what's going on, just like I was explaining to you guys out loud, with the quotations. You're going to see what it looks like in this piece. So I need to say, at the beginning of chapter 6, readers are once again, I could say Steinbeck returns to the Salinas River from the beginning of the book, except this time the sun is going to go down, and there is a water snake glided smoothly up the pool. Now I know that sounds clunky right now and it's because I'm writing in present tense, but my quote is past tense. At the end of this video, I have a section about how to change that. So stay tuned for that. So right now I'm just going to keep going with my idea and then come back to that later. Okay. So is a water snake, I could just do it here and just say, break apart my quote with the word which. That might help smooth it out a little bit. Okay, a water snake which glides smoothly up the pool and is unaware of a motionless heron which ends up. Now here I'm just going to show you because I can't write it. I can't help it. I have to put it into present tense, into swallowing, otherwise it just sounds too weird. So I just put brackets around ing, which I changed the ed into an ing to make it present tense. Swallowing the little snake. Okay. But when another little water snake approaches the waiting bird, Lenny interrupts the scene and the heron flies away, which allows the second snake to escape. So notice I got away from the quotation there, and that's okay. And then my page number, Steinbeck, PDF 50, because my kids are using a PDF. All right. So this is my example, selective quoting. I've worked in some context. Now, I might decide, is it really that important that I quoted water snake? Couldn't I have just said snake and not quoted anything? But, it's kind of cool to work it in there. So let's read it again. At the beginning of chapter 6, Steinbeck returns to the Salinas River from the beginning of the book, except this time the sun is going down and there's a water snake which glided smoothly up the pool and is unaware of a motionless heron which ends up swallowing the little snake. Oops, I got to end that quote, right? I didn't put my end quote there. So that's the other thing I got to make sure. That's why I reread, right? But when another little water snake approaches the waiting bird, Lenny interrupts the scene and the heron flies away, which allows the second snake to escape. So what you should notice in reading it back is when you hear it aloud and you're not looking at the text, you can't necessarily tell where I quote and where it's me because it flows so smoothly. You have to be reading it to see where I did direct quotation. And that is the magic of selective quoting, is the flow is just going to be so smooth and you're going to incorporate your examples in such a way that your reader's just going to go with that flow as well. Now, of course, after this is when I would explain the significance of this and what it means and how it foreshadows and what it's foreshadowing. But that's commentary. That's another video. That's another time. So hopefully that helps out with you. And now we're going to move on to our final method, quoting whole sentences. Now that we've looked at paraphrasing and selective quoting, let's look at our final method, which is quoting whole sentences. When we quote a full sentence from a work, we first need to ask if it is necessary. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the way the author said something can't be and shouldn't be stated any other way. It just all works together and you want to keep it the way it is. Now remember, if your quotation takes more than 3 lines on your essay, you need to talk to your teacher to figure out how to do the proper formatting of your page for the essay. We have to do a thing called block quoting. I'm not going to go over that in this video because that's a little bit more advanced step, which I can share in another one later. So if you're going to quote something and quote the whole sentence, you need to make sure you give some context for your example. You can't just plunk the quote in. This means you need to tell us where you got it from in the text. So think, what was going on right before this moment? Some websites will give you suggestions that when incorporating evidence, you just say the page number or chapter, but I don't find it very helpful when a student writes, on page 63 it says blah, blah, blah. That just doesn't give me any context. It's just a label of where I pulled it from. Now, sometimes that can work well with poetry because line references are so pivotal in poetry, but it's much more helpful to give us what the situation is in the text. What was written about right before this line? What was going on and who was involved? Don't be too detailed, but just give us an idea. Try to get that in a phrase. If it's your second example in a body paragraph, then explain where this is in relation to the previous example. Is it later that day? Does it involve different characters? Is it in another stanza if you were analyzing a poem? Is it after a key text feature or moment? Let's look at an example of how to quote a whole sentence and give it context. So here we go. It says, this is describing a character, Lenny, from the beginning of the book. It says, behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large pale eyes and wide sloping shoulders, and he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags his paws. His arms did not swing at his sides, but hung loosely. All right, so for this one, the key sentence is the one with the bear paws. So that's the one that I'm actually going to quote, but I need to give it some context, kind of like I did when I was just first giving you this. I told you who it was about, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some context to lead into it. Now, what's also nice with this one is because of this semicolon right here, this semicolon is actually being used to separate 2 complete sentences. So I could just use the second part and not use the beginning part, because is it really matter, those other descriptions of Lenny, if I'm really focusing on the bear part? So that's what I'm going to do. So I know technically I'm not going to use the whole sentence, but I am using a complete sentence. So I want to make that clear. I could use the whole thing. It would work either way just fine. So for my context, remember I need to explain kind of where this is, what's going on. So I would just say something like, in the beginning of the novel, we first meet Lenny, who is described as one who Well, it says he walked, is described on page 2 as he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags. I could copy and paste this, right? That's okay. And then I end quote. You'll notice the period goes outside of the parentheses. I get rid of the period that was right after pause in the book because I'm adding citation, so it needs to be moved. The only punctuation I would keep there is an exclamation point or a question mark. Otherwise, I move the period to the end. So it says, in the beginning of the novel, we first meet Lenny, who is described on page 2 as he walked heavily. Now, this is kind of clunky, right? You're like, as he walked heavily. So now that I've quoted the whole thing and given it context, that's when I can wordsmith it. And some of you might do this naturally as you write. That's what I'm tempted to do because that's how I learned. So do I really need that he there? So in the beginning of the novel, we first meet Lenny, who is described on page 2 as, he walked heavily. Okay. It still sounds weird because guess what? That's the next thing we're going to get into, which is, how do I take something that's written in past tense and turn it into present tense so that it actually flows? So stay tuned for that. Now that we've covered how and when to quote versus paraphrase, what about writing in third person present tense? In literature and in literary analysis, you may have heard your teacher say you need to write in third person present tense. That helps bring the text alive. It brings the analysis into the now. Now, the book my students are analyzing is all in past tense. How frustrating. You're going to have to change everything into present tense to have it match with your commentary. So all we really need to do, though, it's pretty simple, is we change the verbs into present tense from the past tense form and put the changes in brackets. I'm going to show you an example from all the ones we've covered so far in this video and how to take those quotations and modify them into present tense so you can see what I mean. All right, so we're back at the example we just did. Now we're going to do our bracketing to make this actually sound normal and not so weird and disjointed. So here's my sentence. It says, in the beginning of the novel, we first meet Lenny, who is described on page 2 as, and this walked is past tense. I'm writing in present tense. I need it to match. So I am going to just change it. I'm not going to change the word itself. I changed walked to walking, or walks heavily. Okay. So I like, instead of being so clunky with who is described on page 2 as walking heavily, I'm just going to get rid of this part. Who we first meet Lenny, who walks, so I can do walks, that present tense, instead of doing walking. Okay. Walks heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags his paws. Now I changed it, but I need to indicate I changed it by putting brackets around what is different. Okay. The other place where I can do that is with pronouns. Sometimes when we take a quotation out of context, it had a pronoun and we need to clarify that pronoun reference. That is why I have Lenny who right here. But remember, the quote actually says up here, he walked heavily. I could have done something different with this wording. So I'm going to show you guys that real quick, how I could do this differently. And I'm going to do it in a separate thing. I'm just going to copy and paste it. So I could say in the beginning of the novel, we first meet Lenny. I'm going to change this. In the beginning of the novel, Steinbeck describes how, and then Lenny. Now that isn't how it is in the book, right? It says he. So I put brackets around Lenny because I replaced the pronoun with his actual name of who it's talking about. That is technically correct. Okay. Now here, because this is the beginning of the quote, I could have just still left my quote with walks, and then I wouldn't have had to worry about the brackets with the name because I wasn't changing the actual quote. I was changing the sentence structure. Either one is correct. Okay. I didn't change the meaning of the actual sentence. I didn't change the word choice, really. because it's okay with a pronoun to change it to the antecedent, which is what it's actually replacing. So this is how I would do that. And both of these sound okay. They're fine. They're great. And just keep that in mind. If you're going to change something in the quotation, and we only do it for pronouns and for changing the tense of the verbs. So again, you're not changing the meaning of the sentence at all when you do this. Thank you for joining me today, looking at how do we quote, how do we make them make sense and flow with our writing. Remember, use a combination. Use paraphrasing, use select quoting, blend them together. Make sure you write them in present tense. Use those brackets if you need to. Make sure you cite all your sources with page numbers and your authors' names. That's what we got to do. Give proper credit. If you want to see more of my material or support my work, just visit my YouTube channel, like and subscribe, or go to my Teachers Pay Teachers page to see more materials that are for sale there to help teachers teach their students how to write, how to read, how to analyze.